Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra, welcoming you to another interesting discussion. Today, we're going to be discussing a paper. The title of the paper is Growth Implications of Pandemic, the Indian Economy. The paper is written by Dr. Arvind Virmani and Karan Bhasin. Dr. Virmani is an Indian economist who was appointed as the Indian representative to the International Monetary Fund in 2009. Prior to that, he was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. He's currently the chairman at the eGrow Foundation. Karan Bhasin is a New Delhi-based researcher with interests in macroeconomics, Indian economy, institutional economics, and political economy. He's an alumnus in Terry Sass, University of London, St. Columbia School. So, Dr. Virmani and Karan, welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. All right, Dr. Virmani, I want to start with you. So my first question to you is, before we get into the specifics of the paper, I actually wanted to know that, let us begin with this, that can you give us a brief idea, a sort of a summary of the entire paper, and what are the key points that that you guys were trying to make through the paper itself?
So the main objective of the paper was to give an idea of firstly what is different about crisis, crisis economics, because the normal analysis fails. The normal issues are not there. They are unusual issues. And then to within that, how the pandemic was different from other crises like the global financial crisis, etc., which we have faced in the post-war world, and how to think about it, what are the kind of special economic issues and special ways of thinking which are required. That was the idea of both for people who want to analyze the economy for their own purposes, whether it's business or trade, and of course even more, because my specialty is on policy, is how policymakers and policy advisors could think about it. And then, of course, to go into some of the details which were already on the table, the lockdown, the crisis, and what would happen, what was likely to happen, and what needed to be done as the crisis evolved. So basically, that was the overall focus. Then, of course, as part of that, we also did some estimates, etc.
All right, Karan. So let's start with this. So one of the top points that you all have raised in the paper is force majeure and legal issues. Now, obviously, this is a very, very tricky part, and this is one of the treacherous areas that we are entering because, as of now, the economy is shut. A lot of contracts were basically signed or dealt with, or a lot of agreements which were, held between different corporations were held before the shutdown or the lockdown, when businesses are shut. Now we don't know when the businesses are going to be opening, and this is such a tricky area. So what are the possible problems that both of you have envisaged? So Karan, so what are you so could you actually elaborate on what are the things that you guys have pointed out here in the paper?
Okay, so one of the key issues that we discuss is that this is actually a problem for businesses in the sense of a cash flow mismatch. Their financial liabilities continue, but there's no money coming in, and that creates a lot of problems for even servicing or honoring a lot of contracts. Whether it is a contract with your landlord, whether it's a contract with banks, etc., regarding your debt. Now, one intervention when it comes to bank and your financial liabilities was the form of a moratorium, which was already granted. But for an economy like India, where you have a massive informal sector, there and in informal sector, of course, there are no well specified contracts. So that's one part of the problem that could be there in the informal sector. But for the formal sector, even when there are these contracts with force majeure, which is basically an act of God, etc., that are a part of the sort of contract or the agreement, enforcement becomes a key problem. Now, there was a lot of discussion regarding government intervention when it comes to rent agreements, etc., that was going on for a long time, and some countries have provided some support. in the form of policy measures. But of course, it's a bilateral issue at the end of the day, because it's a contract that two parties have entered into. And we may not discuss it in very much detail in the paper, but I mean, as far as these contracts are concerned, there is a tangible possibility of an increased enforcement issue over foreseeable future, which will obviously act as a drag on our legal system. And I think probably Arvind sir is the best person to discuss some of this, because he has been talking about legal reforms for many years, legal and policing reforms. So I think he should probably outline some of this, even though this is not covered explicitly because this is a separate issue. But I think this is an important point that should be discussed.
Yeah. So actually, I want to actually, as part of your first question, I should have given a very brief, because I emphasized as the important thing was here to people must understand the way to think about it, because it's different. So very briefly, what I want to do is that the structure of the paper, which was thought of, is that basically there are three parts of the economy, call it sub-aggregates of the economy, and three phases in the context of which all issues actually have to be thought of. And if you mix these up, there's confusion. And really the legal issue is most important in that phase one. So what are the three sectors of the economy which have to be thought of in this context of the pandemic crisis and lockdown, etc.? The first one, of course, is the actual lockdown. The second is post-lockdown, when some of the issues which arose from the pandemic, which was basically a problem of contact, what we called, to analyze this. And the third phase would be going back to recovery. So lockdown, transition from recovery, transition to normal, and kind of normal and recovery to growth processes. But to do this, we had to divide into three sectors. One is, of course, essential commodities, which were exempt from the lockdown. The second one is what we call the contact sectors, where by the nature of the service, there are lots of people present. The simplest one to think of is, of course, airlines. If you're traveling by air, everybody is being served simultaneously, so to say. So there are lots of people. So there's a possibility of the virus spreading. And therefore, this is something before the lockdown, and it will continue. The fears which have been aroused by this will continue to affect these sectors, whether or not there is a lockdown. And finally, the rest of the economy, which now I prefer to call MMCANS, which is manufacturing, mining, construction, and allied services. So if you're thinking of analyzing this, it is better to break it up in the sectors. Let me just give the quick analysis, which links up to your legal and force majeure issues, which is, in a lockdown, actually it's not just the pandemic, it's the government order. So government has given an asymmetric order to say, okay, everybody besides essential commodities, whoever's producing essential commodities continues as more or less usual, but everybody else has to shut down. Now, that means that if I'm a producer in this MMC and AS economy, my production, sales, everything is shut, but my legal obligations continue. So if I had a legal obligation to pay rents, interest, repay debt, keep certain, if one is large, to keep certain people employed, or if the state government suddenly says, oh, you have to pay all the wages. So you've got all these asymmetric legal obligations partly being imposed by the government, which is really a disaster, actually, because if you destroy this sector by this asymmetry, then there will be nothing left to recover in the second and third phase. So it's very important to understand that part of it occurred because of the lockdown. Part of it is occurring because state governments and UTs are giving these arbitrary orders without realizing what they are doing. So in that sense, it is not actually the usual type of force majeure. It is something which is being imposed by government, and therefore it requires special legislation. As Karan hinted, that certain governments have actually made some legal clarifications uh, relating to the pandemic. But here, of course, we would have to do more than that to
Yeah.
make sure that whatever government does isn't treated as legal. That government has to take account of this asymmetry and the legal system, the judiciary, etc. It has to be clarified how they are going to act on it, because otherwise you're going to end up destroying large parts of this sector, which could go bankrupt. So the key issue here is bankruptcy and primarily arising from the legal asymmetry. Then, of course, as you open up transition, the other economic issues which start coming in.
I want to quickly add to that bankruptcy point of view. One of the key things that we mention while doing those projections is that it is very important to prevent bankruptcies and job losses, because if a firm goes bust, that represents a permanent loss of income for and a permanent job loss, and at the same time it represents a permanent reduction in the capital stock in the economy. And what happens as a consequence is that the potential growth rate of India may actually come down, and it may take 2 to 3 years to get back to that level. So the real concern is to prevent bankruptcies from happening, and I think it also relates to a lot of the fiscal debate that we keep on having very regularly these days, that government should not spend beyond a particular amount, etc. But the fact is that if we don't step in to intervene and prevent these companies from going bust, we really risk getting stuck in a 5 to 6% growth phase for the next couple of years, and that could be disastrous,
Yeah.
for our position.
Right. So yeah, so that's very good. Karan has brought that in, because that's the second fundamental thing which I'm afraid when I listen to people on TV and newspapers, they don't seem to understand that this talk of fiscal stimulus is kind of strange when you're actually locked down. And unless we understand the difference between fiscal stimulus in a normal economy versus that when you're in a lockdown or when you're in a transition, you're going to get bad policies. So what is it now? In a lockdown, only 40% of the economy, which is, and these numbers are in the paper, 40% of the economy, which is essential commodities, is operating. So the issue of stimulus is irrelevant. If you injected huge amounts of money into the economy, there'll be no change in demand and supply of essential commodities. Everybody is already consuming that. There is no effect. There is no effect on the rest of the economy, not because it doesn't respond, but it's closed down by an order. This is something which I'm finding that people, so that phasing is very important. When you're talking about the lockdown phase, it's kind of bizarre to talk about fiscal stimulus in the normal sense. So what the government actually has to do is whatever it can do financially and legally to stop this bankruptcy. That's the point which was there. Now, when we transition out, we can discuss that. We can discuss the other two phases. But in the lockdown phase, this whole concept of giving a stimulus, you have to be very, very careful. It's kind of, if you take it to its extreme, you say, oh, US or UK has given 15%, 30%, we must also give a stimulus. It's actually not a stimulus. It is purely a measure to make sure masses of firms don't go bankrupt. That's what the government has to spend on, not just giving a stimulus.
So the right word, Dr. Virmani, would be that when we call the money being pumped into the economy while the lockdown is on, more than a stimulus, it's a sort of a measure to stay afloat, basically to
Absolutely.
avoid to go
That's why it
bankrupt.
has to be focused. Yeah, it's when we talk about stimulus, you think of Keynesian things. You say, okay, you just give money. That will not help. You have to get the money to those firms which have huge debts, which have asymmetric legal obligations. They are going to go bankrupt. Just injecting more government funds into the economy is not going to help any of that, and it's not going to stimulate the economy. That's the point I'm making, which I find that it's very difficult to convey to, that most of the anchors I've interacted with don't seem to get it, even when I'm explaining it to them.
Yeah, and I totally get, and this is a very vital point. I just had a very, very pointed query. I know it's beyond, slightly beyond the scope of the paper, but I can only relate to this scenario. After all, we're all human, and I, being an entrepreneur myself and an MSME in India who happens to belong to the textile industry. Now, I can share my personal experience with you as of now, because I can relate to this bankruptcy aspect as you were speaking so much at a personal level, that since the day of the lockdown, my company account, my current account, has basically stopped receiving any money. I can't even make a call to a customer and say, as they say in our language, sir, ji thodi payment de do. I mean, how would I ask him for a payment? Because he'll be like, "Arey bhaiya, mujhe bhi payment nahi aa rahi hai, to main aapko kahan se do?" And that's a reality. And then in a scenario like this, when you hear the government saying, you can't fire anybody, and then the courts, people go to the courts and stuff like that. So, what
I think that is absolutely. That is what I've been saying. But hello.
Yeah,
Hello?
I can hear you, sir.
Oh, suddenly screen went blank, but I guess you're still there. I don't know
Yes,
Yeah,
sir. Yes, sir.
yeah.
Okay, I'll keep talking, but I can't. Okay, back. Yeah, it's back. Okay, so this is what I mean. It is such a dire and asymmetric situation, which when I hear businessmen, I'm glad you're saying this publicly, but the businessmen don't even say that. And to my mind, it is such a important thing to understand that I have spoken very forcefully about it. When I find that nobody is understanding or listening or saying, it becomes kind of my duty. I mean, to say it. I think it is idiotic of state governments to force. Let me elaborate a bit if you have a little time. To force more legal obligations, like professionals. You're talking about small industry textiles, whether they are professionals, even doctors who are operating. You can't, if their business has gone down to 1/3, you cannot keep saying that they must pay, half or 2/3 of their employees are sitting at home, and the state government gives an order, you got to pay 100% of wages to all of them. It's a recipe. You're imposing bankruptcy on these people, even those who are functioning at a small level, even the essential commodities and services. So of course, with the rest of the sectors which are closed down, there is no inflow at all. But there's a lack of understanding, not only on the business perspective, but also on the social side. And again, I'm saying this because I've not heard this on TV. People are still not understanding what I've been writing and talking about. When only essential commodities are available, the budget of anybody in the country is roughly 30% to 50%, 50% for the poorer, 30% for the middle class, goes on essential commodities. So even if I have no other income and you want to do some social measures, only half to one-third of the income is required. So saying pay full wages is not even a socially desirable thing, because if I'm a poor person who spends 50% of my income on essential commodities, that 50% I will just save. There is nowhere else to spend it on. It's all closed. When you have a lockdown, I cannot order even a small cheap radio or anything. It's all closed. So it'll all be saved. Again, they don't understand that they don't need 100% of the income, even if you're talking from a purely social perspective. So, I'm a little passionate about it, because whenever nobody is mentioning something, I feel it's my duty to kind of explain this thing to the public.
No, I can relate to it not only as an entrepreneur, but at a personal level. I mean, it's such a no-brainer, as you said, that at the end of the day, I was having one of those philosophical discussions with my friend, and I said, you know what, this lockdown actually made me realize that how many fictions are needed to run what we call the economy. Because I sell fabric. Do you really need that fabric? I mean, I was just having a philosophical discussion with my friend. I was like, यार मुझे तो आज पता चला कि कितनी सारी चीजें हम खरीदते हैं, हमको तो जरूरत ही नहीं है, मगर the economy runs like that.
They're not essential commodities, yeah. Right.
Yeah, so they're not essential.
Of course, over a longer period, when my clothes get torn, I would have to buy some.
Yeah,
clothes,
but at a short-term measure, we don't need. And one thing this lockdown has kind of taught us is how many of the things that we buy were not. But now moving on to the next phase, sir. So I wanted to come back to you for the fiscal policy measures that you have suggested in a paper. So could you elaborate on that now, sir?
So the fiscal part becomes very quickly. Let me go to the transition and just point out one small thing, because again, it's relevant to how we get and when we get to the final. So in the transition, basically, you have to have a strategy for lifting, facing this lockdown. And there are basically two or three things which have to keep in mind. And the economic problem it arises, and then we'll go to the fiscal policy which is needed in the conventional stuff in the last phase. Now, in this second phase of transition, it's very important that the entire MMC and AS sector be unlocked at the same time, because they are supply chain. These sectors are complex, right? Especially manufacturing. If you think of it, we've already had this experience from the beginning of the year of Chinese supply chains getting locked down, etc. So when you're unlocking, if you say I'll unlock only in the green and orange zones, all the supply chains will pass through the red zone, will not be able to operate. So in this MMC and AS sector, you've got to lift the lag down for these producers and the allied services which go into it. For example, the transport of these goods, etc., must be opened up all across. That does not mean opening everything. You have to be very careful with two things, and then I'll tell you why you have to open. Okay, let me say why you have to open these in every zone, because otherwise you're going to get local demand supply imbalances, because somewhere you will find there is excess demand, somewhere you will find there's excess supply. So again, the macro economy gets fragmented. The more important issue is to make the economy run smoothly in the transition from lockdown to normal. So again, the macro type of approach doesn't work in this transition because of the pandemic. So for example, the contact services where people are involved, retail markets, large retail markets, hospitality, travel, will have to be closed for a longer period in the red zones. And everywhere one will have to have what I call social lockdown, to convey in a simple way, which is these restrictions on people meeting, large meetings, etc., will have to remain all over the country, particularly up to the orange zones. Maybe they'll be lifted in the green zones earlier, but the social restrictions have to remain, because otherwise we know from history and precedent of other countries that even if the curve declines, so to say, it picks up again. So that's the transition. But again, I emphasize that on the top of the problem of bankruptcy, which remains because of this fragmentation, the real issue is to make sure that the things you allow these supply chains to operate and not get fragmented by fragmented restriction. Now I come directly to your question of what are the fiscal issues involved in when you get to that third phase where you have more or less normalization, which I would expect perhaps to by the end of the fiscal year, this current fiscal year, we should be getting to something resembling normalization. That doesn't mean we are back to the great growth rates or anything like that, but some of the immediate problems of lockdown and this transition should be over, and then this somewhat close to normal thinking on fiscal policy can be resumed. Now the unfortunate thing is that it is not clear at this point, except for those contact sectors, what the demand supply factors are going to be. So what we have recommended, and what I have been recommending actually for a long time, is that use the opportunity to do tax reform and expenditure reform, which simultaneously gives a boost in the short run, but in the medium long term, it increases the buoyancy of the taxes, so the fiscal consolidation, the fiscal can strengthen automatically. This, of course, has the additional boost of improving the competitiveness of the economy, stimulating the what do you call it? Spirits. What do we call it? Entrepreneurial spirits. Yeah, animal spirits, you call it. Yeah. I prefer to call it entrepreneurial spirits, but that's not the common name. But animal spirits, okay, because Yeah, that's
People
the
relate
old.
to it somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just mentioned two of them, and then you can come back see which line you want to pursue. And basically, the two which we have been discussing for the last 2 years, 3 years, earlier papers also, one has written about it. One is GST reform. The other is the direct tax code. And both these are even more important in the current situation because they will affect the MSMEs the most. Because a lot of people, I'm sure you do not forget this because you are in business, but many people forget that the direct tax code is not an issue only of taxation of salaried employees or pensioners, etc. It is a business because the personal income tax applies to businesses. So it is even more critical for non-corporate business to have a reformed direct tax code. And of course, GST we have discussed for the last 3 years how negatively it's affecting the smaller firms, companies, SMEs, trade, etc., etc. And then finally, on the expenditure side, again, similarly, what we need to do, and this gets to your initial intro also, we need to reform the expenditure system basically by taking all the subsidies. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, again it's
Yeah.
gone off. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Oh,
taking
it's just a screensaver, sir. You don't have to worry about that. You just have to
okay,
move your
okay.
cursor
So,
every
so,
bit.
so, yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, you're right. Okay. So the expenditure side that this is the time to reform the subsidies and put them into direct cash transfers uh, uh, based on an Aadhaar link system, which one has been recommending for I don't know a decade or more. At that time, I called was a UID, but Aadhaar now, and the importance of this has gone up because if we had this system in place, etc., related to rail travel, bus travel, etc., have suffered. If we had that system in place, we could have directed it very quickly to these special groups to give them extra money to survive in this lockdown and pandemic type of thing. So let me stop there and then
Yeah.
we can pursue some of it.
So I'll just like to add, one of the things that we mention in the paper is that the way we have to deal with it is the way we would deal with a natural calamity or a crisis, maybe like an earthquake or a flood. And the reason why this is important is that when there is a crisis of that sort, you identify people who have been affected and you direct resources towards them. Uh, Now, as we all know, there are resource constraints that are there, and that makes it very imperative for us to be able to target, identify the sectors that have been worst affected and target resources in those areas. And based on the classification, as Arvind sir rightly mentioned, contact services is probably going to be the worst affected, because even after the lockdown and even after the normalization phase, they will take a lot of time before people get the kind of confidence to either travel abroad or maybe even go to a restaurant and order food, etc. uh, Now, that being said, one of the key issues, and this goes back to the fiscal debate that I had mentioned earlier, is about debt sustainability. And we see this argument going a lot, especially by those who have been warning about credit rating downgrades, etc. That if we give a stimulus, it would have a negative impact on our ratings, etc. Now, the key issue, according to me, that probably needs to be considered, is that what happens if you don't give the stimulus, in any form, and what happens to your growth and what happens to your subsequent interest servicing over the next couple of months. And as Arvind sir rightly mentioned, that when you're doing reforms, you're not just giving a stimulus which is immediately expansionary in nature, but over the course of years it becomes a sort of net fiscal positive measure, in the sense that it is prudent. So if you do a tax reform today, maybe you may lose a certain amount of GST revenue over the next year, a year and a half, maybe 2 years. But because of higher compliance and higher growth rate, eventually it will result in more revenues, and it would be a much more sort of reform system. And I think those are some of the areas where we need to really focus on, because this is a crisis that gives enough political space to do some of those reforms. And as we have been seeing, labor reforms, and that is again something that we all know Arvind sir has been constantly talking about for decades. We didn't see the kind of progress on labor reforms that we have over the last couple of weeks. With In fact, states have suspended almost all labor reforms, which is very different, and a complete U-turn from the conventional policy of protecting them, to the extent that companies needed permission to even fire people once they hit 100 plus employees. So I think that if state governments are able to do some of those reforms, this should be an opportunity where we can build consensus regarding cash transfers, maybe have a plan, 2 year 3 year roadmap of consolidation of our subsidies. And as far as tax reforms are concerned, I don't think that this is the time to be very gradual in it. I think now is the time to do it in one go. And I think Arvind sir would probably agree with this point, and he would like to probably add something on the need to not be incremental going forward, because one of the key things that he explains is that India's growth was on a downward trajectory till 2013. So why don't you sort of explain that reforms, the curve bit that we have discussed uh, a couple of times.
Yeah, so yeah, if the host wants us to elaborate, do you want me to elaborate further on the tax part?
Absolutely, please.
Okay.
That's the whole point of the
Yeah.
podcast.
Right. So on the fiscal side, really, the GST and direct tax code reform have a long history. Now, in the GST, there has been movement, but I will give an answer to a question which somebody puzzled gentleman who follows me, a businessman like you actually, who follows me on Twitter, said. He said, well, the government is simplifying. Why are you saying that, you wanted simplified system? They are simplifying, but I don't see you very happy in your comments. Well, here is the problem. You see, the problem is because when the system is very complex, the smaller, the large people have lawyers, CAs, etc., and who can figure out every change that is made. But when you start making small changes, and there is no clear roadmap and clear final thing, the smaller people get even more confused. If something had 5 rates and you combine two of them, he has a tough time finding out which two you combine. And he's trying to figure out that are there now 5 rates or 4 rates, and where you have changed, etc. So actually, a gradual incremental approach sometimes creates more uncertainty for the groups we are trying to simplify for compliance, etc., which Karan has already mentioned. So not only is this the time, but it is also, as mentioned, that there is a political opportunity also to now simplify drastically, and hopefully, Karan and I are working on the GST part, which hopefully we will have a paper in a month or so. And again, from my experience of doing customs duty reform, the key is transparency. The greatest difficulty I had in pushing customs reforms in the 90s was that the bureaucracy knows all the details, and they can always come up with an objection unless you spend. So I spent days and hours and weeks trying to understand the whole system. Once you understand it and make it transparent, it becomes much easier to counter the arguments which the tax bureaucrat can come up with. So that is one element. On the direct tax code, again, you may know that I was CA during the global financial crisis here. And actually, the last meeting I attended after the crisis was kind of being handled in 2009 was discussion of the direct tax code. and basically the code. And I recently, about a couple of months ago, or about 6 months ago, I found the book dated August 2009, kind of more or less what I had approved as CA. I mean, of course, other people had to approve, but as CA, I also commented on it. And I had raised three issues. This book doesn't include those three issues, but it's a sound analysis based on economics with the objective of drastically simplifying the code. So again, this is not something which if there is an intent, cannot be done. The government could be completely ready by the next budget and introduce the direct tax code in the next budget, and it would have a big impact on the way businesses file. Again, you are a business person yourself, but I have talked to a lot of small people who find it maddening, going from one section to the other, third section, the logic, it's all been built as a ramshackle structure over 50 years of amendments and new sections and modifications and so on. All that needs to be wiped clean and based on simple principles of income. Well, the principles are hard to apply, but the practical compromises, so to say, which have to be made are now known. They are somewhere or the other in the world, they are there, and all these information was brought to bear in the preparation of that code. Now, of course, there can always be some minor modifications which required politically, but this is something which is doable. And finally, on the expenditure side, you mentioned, I didn't go into the detail, but I find again, there is too much tendency to take things from abroad. The UIB, for example, the universal income, right? What's it called? UBI, universal basic income, right? In India, we have a problem which we've been focusing on taxation, on expenditures, is of corruption and evasion. Okay, so unless you think from that angle of a system which takes care of that problem, these words like UBI, they may be right for America or Europe or UK or something, but our situation is very different. I have been dealing for 50 years. In fact, one of my early papers on taxation, well, not the first one. The first one was on optimal income taxation, but one of the later papers was on corruption. How does corruption affect the system? So anyway, the point is, these are issues which had never been, actually, when I wrote that paper, this issue was not found in the tax literature abroad. So those people who recommend tax and expenditure just by looking at something which somebody is saying in the US actually mislead. So what we have done is, in 2000 and in the late 2000, what I had put forward was a negative income tax, which Surjit Bhalla and I have recently, a couple of years back, modified and worked out the details of what can be called a net income transfer, the same initials, NIT. You can call it negative income tax or net income transfer, which preserves the income, the incentive compatibility. So the incentives for tax evasion, the incentive for corruption have to be addressed. And what we designed was this NIT, negative income tax system, which kind of meshes with the income tax. So there is no disincentive problem, in the two. That is the kind of thing we should be thinking of, but that's not something we can do immediately. What we can do immediately is this whole UID linked direct cash transfer system can be implemented, in my view, in the next 6 months. And then perhaps in the next year, one could mesh it into this incentive compatible NIT system.
Just a couple of observations of my experience of doing business in India, where I have found there is that while a lot of time these suggestions that come, jaise aapne kaha ki abhi, we take the example of the Americans or the European societies and we kind of just read a paper and cut, copy, paste it. But the biggest a priori assumption people make is that what works there is going to be working here, is because, but what they forget is those societies are not trust deficit societies. They are trust surplus societies. And our society is a trust deficit society where I don't trust the government doesn't trust me. I mean, I'll give you a classical example. Let us take what has recently happened with the Home Ministry basically giving out orders on what was supposed to be allowed and not allowed in the red, orange, and green zones. I mean, the entire order was like the Schrodinger's cat. It is and it is not there. I mean, nobody could understand that order. And until there was again a social media furor and everybody was outraging on social media, and all it took was 3 paragraphs to say, अच्छा ऐसा है ऐसा है ऐसा है. I mean, पहले क्यों नहीं बता देते? So, I mean, it's always.
Yeah, very good point. That's another way to put what I'm saying. Because I've been in practical policy advice, so I put it actually more basic, concretely in terms of the policies I've advised. But you're right, the philosophical issue is exactly what you say. There's trust deficit. So, in fact, I was telling somebody, a family member yesterday, that our policies are designed for failure. They are not designed for success. The whole outlook is to look at the failures and then design the whole policy structure, whether it's a tax structure or anything else, whether it's labor policy or any other policy. You're looking at the failures, the bad guys, the corrupt, the failures, and then trying to make sure they don't get away with anything, rather than saying, how do we design a policy for the people who will succeed? Because that's how society is, right? It's the good people, the successful people, the entrepreneurs. So unfortunately, this bureaucratic socialism, which we adopted at some point in the 50s or 60s, has resulted in this trust deficit. Exactly, is a good way to put it. And this whole approach of making policy for failure. I mean, there are many different ways to put it, but right now that that word appeals to me. Developing policies for success is what we need to do, not for failure.
So now let us, Karan, let's move into the section of the paper which you guys have titled Pandemic Impact Scenarios. Now, this was something very interesting to me, that you guys actually went into details and kind of presented different areas and different scenarios. So can you elaborate on that? And then obviously Dr. Virmani can also add on to that.
Okay, so as discussed towards the start of this podcast, what we did was that we first looked at the economy and classified each activity as whether it was an essential service, whether it was a contact service, or whether it was in the rest of the economy. The reason why we did this classification was because, in our mind, I think each of these sectors and each of the subsector level activity will experience a different kind of impact over the course of the next one year, or whatever remains of the financial year. And the way we looked at it was that the progression is that first there is this lockdown phase, then there is obviously a gradual recovery phase which lasts about a quarter or two, and then there is some level of normalization. And as Arvind sir mentioned, that this normalization is not back to the 7% that we have experienced, but more close to 5-6, which was the pre-COVID norm. And the way we arrive at these figures is that we look at the growth rates that we experienced in 2019, and we assume that what would have happened if pandemic were to happen in 2019. And we then basically draw some inferences, and based on those inferences we arrive at our final figures for the current financial year. And broadly what we get is that overall growth, the most pessimistic scenario is 0.2%. And this happens when there is another wave of pandemic which hits us, or there's another lockdown that we may have to do maybe a couple of months down the line. So this is the worst case scenario. The most likely scenario, we expect growth to be approximately around 2.3, 2.4, which is closer to a little higher than what the IMF projects. But one of the reasons why we expect it to be slightly higher is because we do anticipate that supply chains would recover quickly, and supply chains do have this tendency to repair themselves on their own. And I think that is one of the reasons why we should not do this red, yellow, green kind of stuff, and we should open them all together so that they can quickly repair themselves within a month or two, and gradually from the next quarter we can see some inventory movements and some restocking happening in the economy. And of course, there's this optimistic scenario where growth is still above 3%, 3.8, etc. But that is, I think, a situation which looks likely, but looked likely at the time we made the forecast. But I think with the lockdown being extended by 2 weeks, and probably it may even get extended further, I don't think that the optimistic scenario is likely to happen. I think probably it would still be the most likely scenario. I think Arvind sir would like to come in over here and probably outline
So
some of.
right. So just add a little bit on top, in a sense, after the develop. So at that time, we had assumed that the most likely case was that the lockdown would be lifted on May 3. Since it has been extended, I have personally, I mean, obviously, we can't keep revising the paper. The paper is on the table already. But my personal forecast, I'm afraid I have had to adjust down. And I just want to mention that. So the range, roughly, the whole range of scenarios in a way has been reduced by about, I would say, about 1.9% from the numbers which are given on the in the thing. And I should explain that because I have repeatedly said from the beginning of January, whether it's global, China or India, that the extent of uncertainty created by the pandemic is unprecedented. In my lifetime. I mean, my normal macro forecast I give plus minus zero point 0.5. When there is a crisis type of situation, I have been giving, or growth recession, which I had analyzed last year. Last year's growth recession in a paper, which is also there on the foundation website, gave ranges of 1%. But this time, not only did the range in a sense expanded to 2%, but and this is something which people have complimented. We didn't give a mean forecast and plus minus. We gave scenarios. I think that's a very important difference, which must be understood. That there is so much uncertainty that anybody who says he's giving a kind of point forecast, really, I'm afraid you should not trust them. And we made very clear that these are scenarios, that there is huge amount of uncertainty. And as I indicated, given that the lockdown is already extended, that I've had to reduce the forecast for the current financial year.
So one quick point that I would want to make over here is with regards to the sort of impact that lockdown will happen or will have on growth. And a 2 month lockdown apparently has a growth impact of around 8%. So we lose about 8%, 8.5% of our economic activity.
I
If we
think
extend the lockdown.
our number was around 9%. But yeah.
Yeah, so 9 was of GVA. I'm converting it of GDP.
Okay. GVA and
Yeah,
yeah, right.
yeah. So 8. Yeah, so 9% of GVA. So suppose if we are growing at if we were to grow at 6% uh, ordinarily, then that means that you are looking at a contraction of minus 3% effectively. And we don't see the second half being so good that you would grow at 6% if the lockdown is extended by another 2 weeks, which is towards the end of May. So as Arvind sir mentioned, that there's a lot of unknowns at the moment. But one thing is definitely certain, and that is that this lockdown, has probably has overstayed its welcome, and now it has started to have a very significant impact on growth. And we mention it in our paper that the costs of the lockdown are not linear, and every subsequent day has a greater impact on growth that gets foregone, and it also has a greater impact on the fiscal position of the government, because in a lockdown, obviously government is also not getting revenues. And at the same time, because the impact is becoming bigger, government also has to give a bigger stimulus, so it becomes a much bigger problem for the government, which is why it is very important to really start opening up the economy as quickly as possible, and revert back to the normal pre-COVID or pre-lockdown, at least pre-lockdown situation, if not pre-COVID. We'll have
Yeah,
to learn to live
briefly,
with it.
Briefly, let me just link that to our earlier discussion. Exactly. In fact, Karan was the first to raise this point with me when we were writing the paper. That is that when the lockdown gets extended, the problem of bankruptcy, which I elaborated on, won't go into again, actually accentuates non-linearly. That was the point which, and therefore, more and more of whatever government's expenditure, I don't want to call it stimulus, you remember, because of the reasons I said, will then in the transition have to go towards making sure that there are no mass bankruptcies. And one of the issues there is, which I think the government should act a little quicker. I just want to mention it, put it on the table, because again, the incentive compatibility problem is like backstopping risk sharing with the banks. 75% of them are, of course, public sector. Banks be a little more free in providing credit to SMEs, etc., who in principle are not insolvent, but can come out of this crisis by the end of the year.
So I just wanted to add to this part, and this again links me because obviously I look at things as a businessman and and obviously I'm a philosophy nut. So I always like to look at things either from an entrepreneur's perspective or as they say in Punjabi, a Vela philosopher's perspective. So I only have two perspectives, either of a Baniya businessman or of a Vela philosopher.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Now, I agree with you, the economy should open. But there is a serious debate on the other side. I don't buy the LCD argument that, oh, but you don't care for lives. I don't even want to entertain such a low common denominator argument that you don't care for lives. And if that is the argument, then basically we should shut everything down. We should not allow cars. We should not allow trains. We should not allow planes, because every life is so precious. That's not the argument. We obviously, beyond a point, we hedge our bets. But this is a serious issue of how do we go about opening the economy. So I would slightly differ, because I look at a city like Mumbai right now. Now I was looking at the data of the GDP and the purchasing power parity, and the top 9 basically income generators and contributors to the economy happen to be the 9 cities in India. So these 9 cities are the major drivers, but the impact of the disease, the highest, I mean, yesterday's number, if we were to look at, there were more than 12,000 cases now in Mumbai. Now, the thing is, right now, the spike, nobody knows what the spike is because there is, I mean, we can call it, it's a good lockdown, bad lockdown, inefficient lockdown. Once we get over that, but still there is a semblance of a lockdown. Once we open this, we don't know what the spike is. So don't you think that we should do some basic ground preparation? And we can't have a standard policy for green, orange and red zones at a very blanket level?
So your question is a very good one, and it is very important, not just for business, but for everybody to understand this. So again, I'm going to spend another little bit of time on this. See, the discussion of 0 and 1 full lockdown, 0 no lockdown, I think is misleading for policymakers and those who are advising policy. Unfortunately, that is how debates generally develop. And that is not the right way to think of it. The right way to think of it is, given this situation which you have outlined, right? There are cities where the bulk of cases and deaths are occurring. What is the best policy? There is a policy in between. The issue is not 0 and 1. Please let us give, this is part of the message which unfortunately, I couldn't it was an economics paper, so one couldn't discuss all the gory details, though there are some details of the lockdown issue, specifically the lifting. But that is what I have been trying to convey. You have to think of what is the best policy for these cities. If you say, okay, the top 10 cities in India have the biggest problem, what should we do about them? And what I'm trying to say is that here is the thing. It has been spelled out. I've tried to spell this out and give. I gave you the broad structure earlier. Social lockdown, economic lockdown, and the three sectors of the economy. So I won't repeat it in the same form. Let me put it in a different way now. The part which I have not emphasized. What do we mean by social lockdown? There are a set of things which we know, which now actually there is research showing that these things do work. And I am not at all saying you must not do that. You have to do it. Those things have to be applicable to everybody, including to workers in factories and anybody in that factory economy, which I'm saying liberalized. Liberalized means you're just lifting the lockdown, but you're still imposing all these conditions. What are they? One is cleanliness, personal hygiene and social hygiene, right? Civic hygiene, hand washing, clean toilets. You have to insist on that. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. Second one, wearing of masks. For whatever quality one can wear masks, they must be done. An ordinary person even can tie 3 rounds of cotton cloth around his face. That will work for him, that's fine. Some of us, we can afford better quality masks. If we feel we are sick, we should wear better quality masks. Okay, so that second point. Third point is that this social elements of lockdown, which is section 144, it must not only remain in operation, you must say that you are not allowed anywhere. You can't say this is a private gathering and we'll have 100 people. The section 144 says no more than 5 adults or whatever it is, 4 or 5 adults can gather. This should be more stringent. It should apply to seminars. They should not, IIC or wherever you go for a seminar, not allowed. You can't have more than 5 people there in Bombay, Delhi, wherever. Okay. Similarly, distancing, physical distancing. Again, I like to use the word physical because it's more evocative. I'm afraid, everybody is not very educated like us, even if they have a BA degree credentials. The physical distancing conveys the idea clearly. We must maintain in public, even if we are going out for work, we are going out to buy something, we are going to a shop which is selling essential commodities, we must maintain this 2-meter distancing. And employees in the economy who are freed up in Bombay, Delhi, etc., must be required to do this, and so on. There's a whole slew of measures which can and will and must continue. We are not saying lift the lockdown, meaning you're going to lift everything connected with the lockdown. No. All we are saying is that MMC and ANS, which I'm emphasizing again and again, those activities related to it, including workers going to the factory, etc., must resume. If it is not just a red zone, but a locked district, you can be a little more district or mohalla or whatever it is, you can be a little more strict. You can insist that anybody near that, it cannot open 100%, for example. This is already in the public domain. They are saying only 1/3. So you can always vary those things to make sure that this overall purpose of physical distancing, maintaining cleanliness, etc., becomes easier and is done. So there are a whole bunch of things which in the middle of lockdown and no lockdown, which you can and must do for at least 2 months, or at least till the growth rate of these cases and deaths starts. Growth rate, I'm talking the conventional way of thinking, growth rate, not just number of cases. I think, for an economist, that's a little, it's okay for public debate and discussion, but it's the growth rate which matters. And that must, all these things which I'm saying must be maintained, can only be lifted when we are getting close to zero growth rate. So there's a lot of things you can do, you must do. And that is where the debate should focus.
All right, now let us take it to the last aspect, which I think connects perfectly to what you have just mentioned, Dr. Virmani. That is the post-crisis recovery. Because as you had mentioned that, this opening of the economy and all the different measures that we are talking about, they are part of what could be largely called a post-crisis recovery plan. But how do we come out of it? It was just striking me now. Okay, we open up the economy. It's very natural. Now, there are multiple business models. There are multiple ways. Now, let's say I live in the city of Mumbai. Now, what do we do? Most of the people who travel in Mumbai either use the buses or the trains or these things. Now, so how would a person travel? That becomes a very, very, very serious issue. Let's take different businesses, right? Now, maybe in my factory, we can afford physical distancing norms and we can work around it. But what I was thinking about is a lot of times Indian business models, like there is a famous, I'll tell you, a famous South Indian restaurant in Mumbai, in Matunga, is Madras Cafe. Now people line up to eat idli and vada in the morning outside the Madras Cafe. So now how are we going to manage? Because every business will have its own nitty-gritties, its own intricacies, its own problems. So when we talk about a post-crisis recovery, how are we going to develop different strategies based on this?
Yes, so again, go back to the division. That division was made very carefully. What examples you're giving me are contact services. Okay, you go to a restaurant, there are tons of people there. If it's a good restaurant, there are even more people packed in. If it's an eating place, whether it's a dhaba or a stall outside on the road, those are contact services. That constitutes 10% of the GVA. It constitutes 10% of employment. That will have to be slowed. There is no escape. You can't say, oh, these are poor people. The point is, if you have concentrated people and they are poor, the spread will be even faster. They are the ones who will also die. So please, let us not bring this issue of, poor, rich. You have to think unemotionally and clearly. These are the contact services. They will be delayed. They cannot be opened in Bombay red zone, in Delhi red zone for at least 2 months. Okay. So and there's no, it requires hard work. I mean, okay, let me tell you, you're saying, how will it be done? In government, I have, I don't know, I was going to say 50 years, but maybe 30 or more years of experience. When we had difficult problems, whether they were politically difficult or there were too many vested interests, there were contradictory views, what we used to do was set up a committee. If you had a good chairman and a good person to assist him, secretary or whatever, then many of these things got resolved. Okay, that is the way every state government, every union territory, the union government, they must do that, because otherwise you don't get all the views. The idea of committee is not like they are super intelligent beings. They bring different information. I'll give you just one small example. And I don't know this from inside, this is what one read, that the medical establishment said we must lock down all migrants and not allow them to go back to rural areas in the beginning. This is what one heard. I don't know to what extent it's studied, but it's a good example of how the point I'm trying to make. They said, because they gave one side of the argument. If they had a committee, which I'll give you the other side. This side of the argument was, if they are infected and they go to rural areas, there are no facilities. It will be a disaster. Tons of people will die. Well, the other side of the argument, which if there was some kind of a committee structure, somebody who knew the slums where these migrants lived would have told them. In fact, I found out from home only because one of my close relatives actually has worked in slums and knew what was happening there. Okay. And that person could have told these people if she was on the committee. So what was that? It was that when you are in a slum, it's closed. They are not like you and me who are sitting with tons of rooms and we can go all over in a lockdown. They are in close proximity. If the virus gets in there, it will spread like fire. And we know this from historical experience of London in the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make is that these committees bring different perspectives and information. So if they had thought of that, they may have been a little more careful in saying, okay, let us carefully see people who can go home. If we can screen them and they don't have the virus, we will allow them to go home. In that process, a lot of domestic transmission actually could have also been avoided. The point is not to critique. The point is, when there is so much uncertainty, you must have diverse information and views, and you need to bring it, and it can be resolved. You don't have the information. You're saying, how will it be resolved? I'm telling you, every issue where I have received various types of information, I can tell you what to do. But it's not like I know the whole country. I don't know what is happening in Mumbai. The Mumbai government, the Maharashtra government, Mumbai government should have a committee for Mumbai. If Mumbai is such an issue, they should have a committee like this and discuss all these issues and come up with an outcome. If they told me all the information, if they had the committee and they told me information, I will tell you exactly what to do. But I cannot do that on the basis of no information. I can only give you the general principles.
So basically, what you're recommending is more of a horses for courses, where we look at the data, we look at the micro level, we
There is no
decentralize the
other
system.
solution.
So
Yeah, but
basically,
I've
the
given you
solution
the
is
general thing.
decentralization.
Yeah, the actual implementation has to be decentralized. There is no other way, because, but that division is already being done, right? We are saying the problem, all the problems you are given is in the red zones, and within that, the cities. This is something a research. I mean, a month ago, I had come across this paper, a research paper, which showed that the Spanish flu spread. It's concluded that Spanish flu spread in UK through the London slums. Now, once you know that, shouldn't you be thinking more carefully of your own slums in Bombay and Delhi? You know, I mean, you have to do it. You want policy for those areas. You can't say, oh, tell me, tell you how. First, go and see what is happening. What is the information there? Policy can be worked out. We can't just throw up our hands and say, no, we will just do a random thing without thinking about the issues and somehow it'll be fine. No, it'll be a disaster. You have to make choices. And choices can be only be made on the basis of information and discussion. And if you have to have all the information.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. In fact, one of the most important things when I was studying the Spanish flu was that, and to connect it to your slum point, was that they were putting people inside tents during the Spanish flu. And what they noticed was that people who were living inside the tents in those enclosed areas, they tended to catch it far more, and it used to spread far more than in comparison to, let's say, people who are outside the tents. And because they were more spread out, and so that it makes perfect sense with the point of the slums, that obviously when you're in a closed enclosure, and it's easier said than done. I mean,
last thing, rural versus urban, that point, which actually there is again research. What they have found in the USA, the states, Oklahoma and Arkansas, which are the most rural, have the lowest number of cases.
Yes.
So there are advantages to being in rural, even if we don't have very high quality health. Exactly the point you're making, very important point. In all my design, etc., I've taken account of this, but I can only take account of all the information which is available to me. And one of those is, yes, there's open air, there's natural physical distancing in low density area. So in some ways it is better there. Just exactly what you said.
Yeah. So Karan, now let's get into the post-crisis recovery. So how do we go about it, Karan?
Well, as I mentioned, supply chains tend to repair themselves, and we have to allow them to really, function and operate without any hindrances. But I mean, we have to also acknowledge the fact that some social or physical distancing is going to stay with us for a long time. And till the time there's a vaccine, people will have to be very careful, and there has to be an appropriate strategy, which may also involve requesting those above a particular age group, since they are in the vulnerable section, to avoid going out, etc. Now those are finer issues that need to be identified, and a comprehensive strategy has to be made. As rightly mentioned by Arvind sir, that this requires a decentralized approach, and we are already witnessing some of it, because we're witnessing different states have had different success in terms of contact tracing, etc., and that has reflected in the number of increases of COVID cases, deaths, etc., over the last couple of weeks. So a one size fits all strategy may not really work per se. But I would say this, that the post crisis recovery has to focus on two things. First has to be that how do we go back to the pre-COVID situation, which is growth rate of 5-6%, which we were getting, which was during the growth recession. And the next part has to focus on how do we get back to 7 and 8. Now, getting back to 7 and 8 seems more likely to happen only towards the end, of or mid of next financial year. I think the first quarter of next financial year could also be somewhat turbulent, depending upon how the crisis progresses. And for that, obviously, we do need a medium-term strategy, and I know for a fact that Arvind has been on this for the last several years, that we need to bring supply chains to India, and government has also, started talking and thinking in those terms. And we see state governments also take a lot of initiative on the state level reforms. The important thing would be to acknowledge that now that we have gone down that path of liberalization, reforms, deregulation, etc., we have to keep going. So we have done labor, now we need to do land, we need to do electricity. There's this new electricity bill, we must go ahead with it. We have to resolve the sort of electricity tariff structure that cross subsidizes residential electricity by charging the industrial customers high. That needs to definitely go away. So there is a medium term opportunity that this crisis presents us, in the sense that people are going to move away from China. The sort of demographic profile of some of the advanced countries do not give them the opportunity to really cultivate a domestic manufacturing setup. So naturally, I don't see a deglobalization to that extent that many are fearing. And there will be still some over reliance, and there will be globalization 2.0, which hopefully may be minus autocratic regimes like China. In which case, India is likely to benefit. Uh, the key would be, how do we maximize this opportunity, and how do we not miss this bus? Because we have missed this bus 2 or 3 times. As far as whatever I've read, I was probably too small, and the first time we missed it, I wasn't even born. But yes, we have missed this opportunity in the past, and we clearly cannot afford to miss this one, because we may not get another chance like this. So our duty, custom duty, we need a complete relook at all of them again, because what has happened over the last couple of years is that we have started increasing tariffs. Uh, Now, I'm not someone who would say that tariffs are necessarily bad, and that you need to move towards free trade, etc. But what I would say is that we need a very prudent, supply chain oriented view of how to levy tariffs. Custom tariffs cannot be considered from revenue raising perspective. They have to take a comprehensive view of what kind of manufacturing you want to incentivize, etc. And having said that, now is also a good time to revisit the debate regarding free trade agreements. We have had free trade agreements with developing countries, but we have so far hesitated, or been reluctant to have them with countries like EU, UK, USA, etc. Now with UK out of Brexit, there is that opportunity, and US also wants a trade deal with India. So the key question is, are we willing to give the kind of concessions in agricultural sector, which by the way will be very important for our agricultural sector to really transform themselves. So they are to some extent in our interest. So those are the kind of political calls that government will have to take over the next 6 to 8 months. And in our paper, we basically outline that what is needed is a calendar of reforms that looks at these particular issues over the next couple of 6 to 12 months, and then starts addressing them one by one. And through them we can probably try to resolve some of the long-standing issues and get more of the investments and companies exiting from China to India, because ultimately at some point we do need an industrial sector to absorb surplus labor from agriculture, and that is the only way we can sustain a high growth rate. So it's just that this is a brilliant opportunity, and probably we may never get an opportunity like this ever again. And with that, I would really want Arvind sir to talk about this, since he's been working on this a lot for the last couple of years. uh,
Yeah. So basically, Karan has given the whole perspective, but let me add a few things and give a slightly, it's more of a communication issue of how to present it. The basics, we are in complete agreement. So let me go through, agricultural reform. The basic thing is decontrol of trade. We have too long treated farmers as if they are children who everything has to be controlled. They are out there who can't look after themselves. The problem is you have to create the environment, and like everywhere else, it's the competitive environment for their products and their inputs which will actually favor them. The old days where the Sahukar controlled everything, 70 years ago, people keep repeating that nonsense. You really need now to free them up. You're controlling their land, you're controlling everything that they do. So decontrol. So it has started. So the trade, as Karan also pointed out, UP, Madhya Pradesh, etc., several states have started that process of decontrolling the trade and creating a more competitive environment. So there are a whole bunch of, there are also exim issues, again, from my experience of years in government, this arbitrary export-import controls have never benefited agriculture. So we need to clean that external part of agriculture also. So agriculture is one. Taxes and expenditures I've already talked about, so I won't go repeat. Then there is the external sector, and here I want to put a slight perspective on this. Really, and first actually mention something which is your field, textile. I have long been talking about textile, by the way, is the only sector where we have specific import duties, the only one. And I have for decades heard from importers of various types of textile materials that there is huge corruption. The bad guys always misclassify, the good guys get shafted in the process. So just cleaning up that simple thing, it is an ancient practice of having specific duties. Just make it a simple ad valorem tax rate. So that's one specific to textiles. But on a broader plane, the way I would approach it in this new world, so to say, post-pandemic world, is to think of it in dual terms. One set, and there is only one country, I don't even need to mention it, which is the key focus, which have exploited the global system, non-democratic dictatorship, which has overwhelmed, the thing. So the duality has to be between such mercantilist countries and the rest of the world. Let me take the rest of the world first. That is, and there, as Karan mentioned, what we should really do now to get the supply chains is to focus on free trade with the developed countries where the supply chains originate. So an FTA with USA, EU, UK makes a lot of sense. Okay. On the other hand, things like the RCEP, etc., which will feed into this asymmetric policy of certain countries, is a bad idea. So there actually, when we re-examine the duty structure, which Karan has correctly mentioned, really what we must do is have a dual approach. That is, focus where we are being exploited in some sense, where the free trade really doesn't apply. There we have to carefully examine all these custom duties and focus them on these dumping countries, etc., etc. There's one country on which most dumping duties are, anti-dumping duties are levied. On the other hand, we must make it, how to make it, the supply chains function from USA. Most of the supply chains end in USA, the rest end in EU and a few in UK. There the free trade has a meaning. If we can reduce those tariffs, simplify them for these countries, that will give a big stimulus to the Make in India, import substitution, etc., the supply chains coming there. And so that's one thing. Then of course there are other areas. The land problem is sought to be. I think that's a good first step, where they're talking about creating a land bank so people can come in quickly for the supply chain. I think that's a good start. But I think on the agricultural side, they need to free it up. In many states, an individual who has a land can't even build an office on his land without permission. It is absurd. I said that we treat farmers like children. They can't even use their own land to set up an office complex. Let's say they wanted to set up an industry. They can't do it. Land use laws don't allow it. You have to start thinking of freeing them up, empower them, let them make these decisions. They are not children, where the adult government has to make all these decisions. Okay, so and then the electricity has already been mentioned, and there's a whole list of other sectors we have also mentioned. But let me stop with that.
So this is where again we find this. You hit the nail on the head here, where you say that again there is this infantilization of the general citizenry on the part of the state. And while I was reading your papers, especially this part, which was the last part of the paper, every time I would read it, the thing that would go inside my head was like, but that's not how they look at us, don't they? that's not how they look at us. They look at us as if we are some chota kaka. As in Punjabi, we have this word of kaka nu ekho. So we are those chota babies, and those babies are running away everywhere. And then the dada of the house has to come and say, "Oi, idhar aayi," and they will fix them, and they will be like, "Eda nahi karida," and everybody will sit in a line, and basically that's how we run our country. And again, I mean, to me, at a personal level, and when I was actually talking to Karan on the phone, when we were discussing this podcast, I use these exact words to Karan, that we have an opportunity of the lifetime, actually, in a very weird way, because of the pandemic. We literally have an opportunity of a lifetime. Otherwise, we had skipped the manufacturing bus in a major way. We basically had avoided. And I can tell you, being in the textile sector, the kind of young demography we have, and the kind of low skilled workforce that textile has the amazing capacity to absorb at humongous numbers. I mean, even if we get like 5% of China's apparel business in India, I mean, in Hindi, we will say, "Yaar, lottery lag jani hai logon ki idhar." People they just don't have the idea of the magnitude of apparel business that China has in this world. I mean, but my biggest fear, Dr. Virmani, is that we have a historical record of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. So before we end this discussion, I wanted to ask you a personal question. How optimistic are you about this time? Are we going to snatch defeat, or are we going to win this one around?
Very good question. I would say if you had asked me this question about 3 months ago after the budget, I had become very pessimistic. Before the budget, I had given if I remember correctly, 2/3 probability of major reforms. After that, I brought it to 50-50. I think the few recent things which have encouraged me to go back to a little bit of optimism, I'll mention very quickly. Firstly, the Electricity Act, that does at least try and attempt to some solution of a problem we have known for ages. In fact, I still remember a committee on which I tried to solve some of those problems unsuccessfully. That's one of my few unsuccessful attempts at reforms in which I was personally involved. The second one is this slew of, I think they are not been fully worked out, but these announcement of labor reforms, suspending certain acts, etc. I think probably that approach has to be reformed, but I see that as a signal that at least they are thinking about it, they are trying to do something, and the thing is back on the table. So I'm encouraged by that. Unlike the negative people will first criticize all the details. They've been recommending labor reforms, even the people who have been recommending for the last 30 years. I'm very disappointed in some of them who I know personally, who start by just criticizing. What UP has done maybe not be the best, but it's not been done yet. It's been announced. It can be refined a bit, and you should be giving, if you really want labor reform, you should be giving the refinements which make it more effective and more long lasting, right? So that's encouraging to me, though. MP and UP and earlier Rajasthan had done a year or two ago, etc. The third one is, of course, agriculture. Again, certain number of states, maybe 3 or 4, I don't remember all the names, had started some of this agricultural reform. Yeah, of course, there were e-markets. Some people were very restrictive, etc. Again, I think it's UP and MP which have restarted that cart. They are beginning to do it. So at the state level, you're beginning to see movement. And my understanding, I mean, my judgment would be, again, I have no inside information on the union government, but I think there's beginning to be a little bit of coordinated action between the union government and the states with which they have good relations, at least. And that makes me hopeful that finally, earlier I had given up because I thought there was nobody was listening. There are things which I had been talking about very politely, very stimulatingly, and giving solutions, which suddenly it came to me that nobody is listening in a real sense, not that you hear something from this side and goes out that side. So what the recent development suggests to me that there are now people beginning to listen. Even statements made by Mr. Gadkari, etc. I'm beginning to get the impression that perhaps the union government and, of course, the state example we are given are beginning to think about these issues, and And given the pandemic gives a political opportunity, which I think Karan has already mentioned several times, that things may happen. I would increase my probability of significant reforms, up to maybe 55% right now.
So, Karan, are you at 55% or less than that?
I am generally an optimistic person. I believe that probably this time it may happen, simply because this is a government which has a huge mandate. To let it go waste is just not something that we can afford. And I hope that people do recognize this in power, that they have this once in a lifetime opportunity to pivot away from Nehruvian socialism. And if we don't do it now, then I don't see it happening in future. This mandate will never come back. So that's why I'm well aware that this is a once in a lifetime moment for the country, and I hope that people in power also recognize it.
I sincerely hope that your optimism ends up being very true. But my experience now, I've been an entrepreneur for 20 years, and my whole understanding of living and doing business in India has always been that Indian entrepreneurship and Indian businesses, they grow not because of the business, they grow in spite of the government. They grow in spite of the government. They find a way out somehow to deal with the government, hovering over them as a boogeyman, sort of a boogeyman. And it's unfortunate. Have things improved since the 1990s? Obviously, I would never say that the things have not improved. But yeah, to me, honestly, at a personal level, this time I'm really looking forward to 2021, because especially when I can only speak about my industry, because I know the kind of potential India has in especially apparels, and people don't realize the magnitude of the opportunity that is literally staring us at our face, where I know brands are like in the position, they're like begging कि भाई कोई बुलाओ तो हमको, तुम बुलाओ और हम आ जाएंगे. It's at that level. But that's for another day, and I hope, Karan, your optimism is right, but it will need, as Dr. Virmani said, it will need a lot of maturity, a lot of analysis, a lot of focus. What lacks in our country, what I have seen every time in a discussion, is we have an allergy to expertise. We have a lot of generalists in India. We don't have people who want to, pin down on a particular subject and then say, you know what, I've read 200 books on just this one subject, and I know a lot about that subject. So why don't you come to me and talk to me? And that's always been somewhat of a grouse that I've had. We don't value expertise.
I would like to discuss the textile industry with you after maybe after this program, or maybe tomorrow.
Sure, sir. It would be an honor. So guys, I think it's time to wrap things up. I'm very conscious of Karan and Dr. Virmani's time. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Virmani and Karan, first of all, for writing a wonderful paper. Thank you so much for I like reading papers. I mean, so when Karan DM'd it to me, I was like, "यार Karan, तूने बहुत अच्छा काम किया, तूने paper भेज दिया, अभी मैं शांति से बैठ के पढ़ूंगा." So I actually read it thrice. So I went through it thrice, and I was like, you know what, this needs to be unpacked. So first of all, Dr. Virmani, I'm very grateful to you that you've come to the podcast, and thanks a lot for enlightening us. All right, guys, you know the drill. Please subscribe to the podcast, like, share, comment. If you want to support me, there are two avenues. You can go to YouTube, you can join the membership program, or you can go to Patreon and you can support me there on Patreon. Until then, I'll see you guys next time. Namaste. Goodbye. See ya.